It's my pleasure to introduce our next guest this morning. John Rustad became the leader of the Conservative Party of British Columbia in 2023. At the time, the party barely existed. They hadn't formed government in nearly a century, and they hadn't elected a single MLA in several decades. But with John's leadership, the party has experienced a surge in popularity. In last year's election, they won 44 seats, the party's best performance in 72 years, almost forming government. It was a campaign focused on ensuring everyday British Columbians could have a voice in their government, a campaign focused on restoring common sense, on creating hope for the future. These are the values that have driven John throughout his entire life. Born and raised in Prince George, John dedicated his life to serving the people of BC. No stranger to hard work, he served over 20 years in the province's forestry sector. He was first elected to BC's legislature in 2005, and he's continued to represent his constituents there ever since. Throughout his career, John has been a steadfast advocate for resource development and economic reconciliation. He served as BC's Minister of Forests, Lands, and Natural Resource Operations. As BC's Minister of Aboriginal Relations and Reconciliation, John signed more than 400 agreements, creating economic opportunity not only for British Columbia, but for all of the nations involved. His deep-rooted connection to the people of British Columbia continued to drive his efforts in shaping the future of Canada's westernmost province. Please join me in welcoming the leader of the Conservative Party of British Columbia, John Rustad.
Well, good morning, everybody. It is great to be able to be here. Despite the fact on BC time, it is very, very early. I have to tell you, it's exciting to be able to be here, and certainly exciting to be with so many Conservatives that are looking for change in this province, are looking for change, quite frankly, in this country. You know, I have to admit that when I think about what we did in British Columbia, lots of people have asked me, how did that happen? How did you guys take the left coast of Canada and actually almost turn it conservative? How do we have that resurgence of conservative values? And I think long and hard about it, and what it really was people are desperate for hope. They're desperate for an opportunity and change. We did in British Columbia, we built a coalition that I think is unlike most conservative groups across this country. We primarily brought together young people, ethnic minorities, rural people, people that looked at it and wanted to say, we want change, we want hope for a future. We want to be able to dream about being able to provide not just for a family, but for our future generations. And I found it interesting, and one of the stops I was at during the campaign, a lady came up to me and she gave me a stone with the word believe. And she said, I just wanted to let you know that you're giving us hope. You're bringing us that opportunity to dream again of a future. When I think about British Columbia, and I think quite frankly about Canada, we have all the potential that we could ever want. I mean, we've got tons of resources. We've got, a great population, a well-educated population. We have tons of entrepreneurs. We've got all of the spirit and drive and opportunity to be successful, but we're hopelessly managed at all levels of government. And that really is what we need to change. If we want to fulfill, quite frankly, our God-given right to something better, then we need to be able to stand up. And I'm sure we'll get into this with Chris a little bit in the conversation, but it was, for me, in 2022, I was prepared actually to retire from politics. And then I got booted out of the BC Liberal Party because I dared to say that the climate change issue should not be the defining moment of our generation. It's an issue, we have to deal with it, but it is not the defining moment. We shouldn't be taxing people into poverty with a carbon tax. We shouldn't be destroying our resource sector. We shouldn't be holding back our potential. We need to be able to provide for people. We need to be able to take advantage of who we are and not be embarrassed about it. And so, because I dared to even question the narrative, I got booted out of the party I was part of and had been part of since 2005, elected. And it was at that point I thought, okay, they can't win. The government that we have was absolutely disastrous, much like what we're seeing in Ottawa today. What are we going to do? How are we going to deal with this? I sat down with my wife and I said, do we leave Canada? Do we move to Alberta? Where do we do? But I love British Columbia. I love this country. I'm a proud British Columbian. I'm a proud Canadian. I do not want to be driven out of this country simply because we have bad governments. And this, to me, is something that we need to all be thinking about. Why are we not thinking of ourselves as Canadians? We have all these trade barriers amongst the provinces, and each province and each region has its different issues they're trying to push forward, and they're saying, oh, we don't care about the other issues. We've forgotten who we are as a country and what brought us together. And I think it's time we actually start thinking once again as Canadians. I mean, with what's going on south of the border and what Donald Trump has done, it's sparked a little bit of this nationalism, and I don't think that's a bad thing. We should be thinking about how we tear down our barriers and support each other. We should be thinking about how we actually renew Confederation. And I am really, quite frankly, concerned in this next election with what's going on, that we will see alienation in this country, unlike we've seen before. I'm very concerned because this is the best country in the world. There is no question. You look from coast to coast with everything that we have, this is worth fighting for. It is something, quite frankly, it was a vision when it was created that I think, quite frankly, we have lost. What's wrong with renewing our Confederation? What's wrong with the idea of taking advantage of the resources? We are the 10th strongest economy in the world, and yet we have had a 0.14% GDP growth annually for the last 10 years on a per capita basis. 0.14%. Compare that to the Americans at 1.8%, or the OECD nation, group of nations with the top 30 nations of the world at 1.4%. We're 10 times off the pace that we should be because we've been held back. And some people say, well, what does it matter? Look, if you want the quality of life that I think we should all have and aspire to, if you want the health care, if you want the services for seniors, if you want to be able to make sure that we keep our youth in this country, we need to be able to do this differently. We need to take advantage of resources. We need to unleash that potential. This is what we campaigned on in BC, because we're in the same boat in British Columbia as much of the country is. We have tens of trillions of dollars of natural gas in British Columbia. You don't think the Americans want that? We've got trillions of dollars of natural resources in Alberta and Saskatchewan and right across this country. And yet we seem to be afraid to unlock that potential. Think about what that can do towards balancing the budget, towards making sure that we can support those conservative values that we have, those values of family and of faith and of freedoms. Those are the things that bring us together, and we cannot be ashamed about standing up and fighting for them. But this is where we need to go as a country. This is what I want to see happen for British Columbia. Because when I think about everything else that's going on, why would we hold ourselves back? You look at policies, for example, that the federal Liberals have brought in, this idea of these emission caps and all these restrictions, and they're talking about trying to be this clean, green, energy power. All of that stuff is just designed, quite frankly, to hold us back and destroy our potential. It's a dream. It's a fantasy. You might as well be running the country on unicorn farts. I mean, it just is not going to work. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned about dealing with these things and dealing with climate. We should be. But let's be realistic. We need to have significant investments in electricity. You can't just replace hydrocarbons. You have to be able to build what replaces it. Wind and solar can be part of the mix, but they're not reliable. So if you want to replace natural gas, that means obviously you're not going to be generating power with natural gas, which I think is ridiculous. That's the cheapest, best form that we could be thinking about using. Obviously, we don't want to use coal. So the only option is to think about using nuclear. But think about what it would take to build out the capacity to significantly use nuclear power. In British Columbia, for example, About 16% of our energy mix is electricity, similar to most of the other provinces across the country. So if you want to replace hydrocarbons, you're talking about having to build out 6 times or more the amount of electricity that you produce. How are you going to do that? That is, you're talking trillions and trillions of dollars of investment in nuclear facilities. And quite frankly, in British Columbia, we're not even allowed to do that. We've got legislation that says you can't actually build a nuclear plant. This is what we have to be thinking about. So hydrocarbons are going to be part of our future for decades and decades to come, even if we want to try to move out and change it. So this idea of this green economy and this whole thing, like I say, it's a fantasy. But what it will do is it will make us poorer. You look at Germany, for example, what they've tried to do with this, and they made huge investments in wind and solar, in what they call renewable energy. Not quite sure how renewable that is when you think about how it has to be replaced. But what it's meant is 3 to 5 times increase in the cost of electricity, deindustrializing the country. Is that where we want to be? What will that do for a country like Canada? So this thing is something I think, it's the reason I was kicked out, but it's the core of what we need to be thinking about, quite frankly, in this country. And it's a core of what I think we need to be talking about politically. Yes, there's tons of other issues, and they're all very important. But if we are not unleashing our potential, if we're not unleashing our economy, we can't solve any of the other issues. Think about the size of the debt and the deficit. It's crazy to think that somebody thinks that is sustainable. It's not. And you can't deal with the taxes. You can reduce government spending. Quite frankly, we need to be going through and doing a significant review of spending, but you need to deal with getting your economy going. And you can't do that with one hand or even both hands tied behind your back. So in British Columbia, this is what we talked about in starting up the Conservatives. We took a party that was at 2% in the polls, and in 18 months, we just about formed government. And because of giving people hope, talking about that opportunity for building that future. As the Conservative Party in British Columbia, we elected more women as a percentage of our caucus than any other Conservative Party in the country. And that's important to think about, obviously, because Conservatives seem to have an issue with connecting with women. I'm not quite sure why that's the case, but it's something that needs to be thought about. We elected about 22-25% of the people that are members that we elected from ethnic minorities, people that have traditionally been voting for the Liberals. They've come over and been part of our coalition. They're strong, they're there, they want to build that future. We need to be able to embrace that. We need to be able to open that and make sure that is part of who we are as Conservatives in this country. Because at the end of the day, when you think about it, everybody that came to this country, whether it was 7 generations ago, whether it was 10,000 years ago, or whether it was just a few years ago or a few weeks ago, people came here hoping to build a future. They came here with that dream of Canada. They came here with that dream of being able to be free from tyranny, be free from the authoritarian governments that they fled from. They came here with that hope to be able to build a future for their children. I was talking with one family in Surrey that came from India 20 years ago. Things have gotten so bad in British Columbia with the crime, with the drugs, with the heavy government hand, that they're thinking of moving back to India. Think about that for a minute. People that came here with that hope and that dream of what British Columbia and what Canada can be have given up and said, it's not here anymore. I'm going to go back to India. That, to me, is a failure of what we are as a country and the promise that we should be. So I look forward to the open conversation with regards to this, but at the end of the day, I sure hope that we have the courage as Canadians to chart a different course. This is our future. This is what we depend on, our children being able to stay here. So many companies that I talk to in British Columbia, they say they're moving their operations south of the border because they can't make it work here in British Columbia. So many companies I see that say it's just too hard. For example, in British Columbia, it takes 15 years to get a mine permit through the process. You go to Sweden, which is more left-wing government than we have, more environmentally conscious than we are here, and they get 2 years to get through a mining process. Australia has 3 to 5 years. Chile is 3 years. 15 years? It's a generation. Which company, who's sitting at a board table would say, yes, I want to invest $2 or $3 billion in opening up a mine, and let's wait a generation before we start to see things happening? That's unrealistic. We just cannot be doing this. This is what needs to change. We have to get government out of the way. We have to be able to unleash this potential. If we don't, I fear for our future as this country, because all we'll do is manage decline and miss, quite frankly, that opportunity we have, that potential that we should have. We need to be able to transform this country. We need to be able to transform this side. We need to be able to deal with this at all levels of politics. And there's one last thing just to touch on before we go into the conversation with Chris. As conservatives, the one thing I find the most is we're entrepreneurial, we're self-sustaining, we are people that just want to look after a family, that want to be able to improve our lives. We don't think a lot, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about how we deal with politics at all levels. And we have to change that. And what I mean by that is the left is controlling our education system, they're indoctrinating our kids, they're going through this process with for example, in British Columbia, they had institutions to train all of our people at chambers, to deal with all of the CEOs, all the people in our municipalities, all with the one goal, which is to indoctrinate people into the left type of thinking. And here we come along as conservatives and say, we want to fight back, we want to push back, but we're not prepared to do that work, to lay that foundation, to make those changes fundamentally all the way through. They've been doing this for decades, and we are way behind. We have to start focusing on getting people elected at school boards. We have to get people elected at cities. We have to get people elected in regional districts. We have to make sure that people that are involved in our chambers have the full understanding of what our potential is and what we need to be doing. If we don't, this is going to be a continuous losing battle for the people on the center-right. And I quite frankly am not prepared to stand by and let that happen. This is why I've stayed in politics. We need to be able to fight for those values of family, those values of faith, those values of freedom. We have to stand up, and that's why I love a conference like this, because it brings together so many people to think and to talk about this, and hopefully to be able to go back out and have action on the ground. So with that, thank you very much for the opportunity to say a few words. I look forward to our conversation with Chris.
So about a year ago, a friend of mine sent me an email. He's from Ontario. He started doing more business in British Columbia. He said, I'm heading out to BC. I'm going to have a meeting with Kevin Falcon, effectively Liberal leader. He says, I think change is coming. There's an election on the horizon. There might be a change in government. And I phoned him right away, and I said, have you been watching John Rustad at the BC Conservatives? And he had no idea, and that's the story. It came from nowhere. You got almost half the seats in the legislature now, almost formed the government, very close. The current government's hanging on with a one-seat majority. What was the catalyst that caught with people that saw you and the Conservative Party of BC as the vehicle for change? And what was it that inspired that part of the population to rally behind you?
It's an interesting question, and when you look and think about it, I mean, there's obviously many turning points, I think, throughout the time in creating it. But there was one point in particular that I think stood out above all. There was a motion that the NDP in British Columbia moved forward to condemn the Freedom Convoy, to condemn the Freedom Movement, and to support all of the actions government took under COVID, including, isolating seniors, isolating people dying alone. There's so many things that went on during that period of time. And so there's a motion that they put forward. And I looked at that and thought, this is crazy. Like, we can't support this. Every MLA in the legislature, including all the BC Liberals, and the two Green Party members and all the NDP voted in favor of that motion. I voted against it. I said, this is wrong. And that sparked a movement. That one thing sparked a movement, and more people then started getting involved in what we were doing. And it really just, it grew bit by bit by bit. And then the second moment, I think, that really made a difference is we had a second person cross over the floor, which gave us official party status. British Columbia has got this weird rule that, two members can be an official party. And it allowed us to ask more questions in the question period. And the first question I asked in question period was about our kids in school and SOGI and the disaster that this is in our school, and this had to change. And the Premier, of course, got up and said, this is absolutely ridiculous. Why would anybody even ask a question like this? And I was thinking, this is about our kids, this is about our future, this is about parental rights. And the BC Liberals got up and gave the Premier a standing ovation. And at that point, I knew that they were toast. They were trying to be left-wing light to get elected, and that just is not what people were looking for in the province. And so those are the kinds of things that really vaulted us forward and gave us that opportunity to be able to build momentum.
So you're now official opposition. You've got 43 colleagues in the legislature with you. Election set for just over 3 years from now, but anything can happen when it's that tight. How do you build on that momentum that you've gained over the past year and a half?
We often say during this last election that we were building the plane as we were flying it. And it's true. Just 3 weeks before the election started in British Columbia, we were planning for a $2 million campaign because that's all the money that we had. And then, of course, with the BC Liberals folding, stopping their campaign, the money started coming in. That by the second week of the campaign, we had shifted to an $8 million campaign, just in terms of it. But really, we were building the structure as we were going through. And so a lot of that is, now that we have gone through that, we've obviously shown ourselves in the House, and it's amazing the work that all of our MLAs are doing in the House and how we've had the NDP back down on so many policies. What we're in the process of doing right now is consolidating what we've built, making sure that we expand out our membership so that we can then push for the next drive that needs to happen. And that could be within the next 6 months to a year and a half before we have an election, or it could be 3.5 years out. But we need to go through this process. And so we just had an AGM for our party. We had 800 people come out to the AGM. It was the largest political AGM in BC's certainly in recent history. We're very proud about that because people are coming out celebrating what we've been building and what we've done as the Conservatives. We went through that process and came out of that sort of re-energized with a change in our Constitution, policies locked in place, and so that's the process we'll be doing now.
And one thing we're seeing across the country, and I think this was true with your movement, is a lot of young people gravitating towards conservative principles now and supporting more conservative parties. While at the other end, we're seeing older folks who are more established, retired, tending to support the status quo, more big government type parties. How is that impacting your movement, and how does that determine the future?
It's a big issue, and even though the millennials, the younger vote, is by population the largest voting bloc, certainly in British Columbia, the older population, the 60 plus, still comes out in larger numbers because they actually turn out. And I think one day the younger population has to wake up and say, it's our turn to kick ass. I'm sorry, it really is. They need to be able to get engaged, they need to be able to fight, they need to be able to get people motivated to be out and voting. But it's more than that as well, because I think we can't ignore, the generation that helped to build this country. We can't ignore the 60 plus. We need to be able to understand what it is that they're concerned about. Change is something that comes a lot easier for people when their whole future's in front of them and they're building, they're adapting. Change is something that comes easier to people who've moved to this country because they're obviously moving here for change. Change is something that is not as easy for a generation that has gone through and already built and doesn't necessarily have a lot of years left in their working career, or maybe they're retired and looking after parents. And so we have to make sure that change is not a scary thing. And so we've got to be able to reassure people who have helped, like I say, helped to build this country, that we are there for them, that we have their back, that we're going to make sure that healthcare is going to be there, matter of fact, be improved, that we're going to make sure services for them, particularly for seniors, are going to be able to be there. The things that matter for them in their stage of life. while at the same time doing what we need to do to build for that younger generation so that they can build that future. So it's something that you have to be able to find that balance on, and we didn't quite strike that tone in the last provincial election, but it's certainly something that is top of mind going forward for us.
And most of your career was in the private sector before you jumped into politics. You talked a little bit about why you decided to do that. How do you encourage other people to do the same, put their lives on hold, maybe have a successful career in business, and come be a part of this? Because I think we've seen over the past 10 years our standard of living decline in Canada, and so many reasons young people are gravitating towards conservatism is the cost of home ownership, which is seems completely out of reach for most young people. Their standard of living declining. So how do you motivate other people to take that leap?
That's an interesting question because everybody's in a different situation in their lives, and I think, quite frankly, we need to pay politicians better. Just saying, and maybe that's from a British Columbia perspective versus other jurisdictions, but the reality is this: for me, I was running my own company. I was successful in what I was doing. There came a point where I was so frustrated with politics in British Columbia. I was so frustrated with the policies in place that were so restrictive on our ability to be able to grow my company and to build a future that I actually sat down with my wife and said, what do you think about moving to Calgary, leaving British Columbia? And so we had a long conversation. My whole family was in Prince George. Her family was in Prince George. I've got a wood license. I was involved in some property development and other business opportunities. And I looked at that and I said, I don't want to be uprooted from my province simply because of policies. And so we made the decision to stay, and that left me with two choices, either to get involved or to live with it. And I'm not the kind of person just to live with it. So I decided I would get involved. And politics was never an ambition of mine, as it is for many people, particularly with people in the business sector. It's not an ambition of theirs because they're busy with their careers and they're busy building with their future. They don't necessarily have a pension or any of those sort of things. And so they're really, focused on that side of things. And somehow we need to be able to reach those people that don't necessarily want to be a politician and convince them that it's the right thing for them to do to be able to build their own future. And it's a hard sell. I mean, you're asking people, whether they're in their 30s, maybe into their 40s, to give up their best earning years to be able to build their future, to say, I'm going to get involved and try to fix what's going on in a province. It's a hard sell for people to be able to do that, but it's an important thing that needs to happen. So it's the reluctant politicians, that it's those business people, the people who've signed the front side of a paycheck, that understand the struggles and the issues associated with making something work. We need more of those people involved in politics because those are the people that understand how to make sure they can secure that future for everyone.
The discussions we've been having around tariffs and the President of the United States of late have really brought out some fractures that have currently existed within the Federation. Premier Smith has been talking a lot about redefining the relationship between Alberta and the federal government. Is that something that's impacting British Columbia as well? Is that something you see as a challenge or an opportunity for BC?
It certainly is. I think about what has happened with Trump, and everybody's like, oh, we've got to push back, we've got to fight back, and there are places and strategic where we need to do that. But I think we need to be very thoughtful in terms of how we do that. Because what our real problem is we are not unleashing our own potential. We're not moving our oil and gas out to tidewaters. We're not linking ourselves as a country. We need to get over that. We actually need to start strengthening our own country. And Trump has given us a window to actually think about ourselves differently to do this. And so this is what I think we really need to be doing. And lots of people, there's change, obviously there's issues, people are uncomfortable with that. But if we were to unleash our full potential, then you can sit down with the administration in the United States from a position of strength and say, how do we work together? You're our most important trading partner. We want to be able to have that good relationship, but we're not dependent on you because we have other options. But as long as we don't do that, we are continually going to be held ransom south of the border. And I'll just give you an example in British Columbia. Close to half of all of our refined products that we use come from the United States. Because half the food that we consume comes from the United States. 20% of the electricity we consume comes from the United States. 85% of our tourism comes from the United States. We are very reliant on them. We're not in a position of strength to be able to push back and that needs to change.
Well, thanks so much for coming out. It's exciting to see the resurgence of a conservative movement in British Columbia on our left coast, which I think everybody in the room is excited about. So we'll be cheering you on, and best of luck.
Thank you very much. I tell you what, I really look forward to continuing to build what we've done in British Columbia. And I think British Columbia has that potential to be that full partner that needs to be there for all of Canada. And we need to unleash that potential, and only a conservative government and a conservative movement can do that. So we are not done with the fight, and we're going to finish this job.
Good stuff.